educated and those who educate. Colleen maintains Cato's private schooling status tracker, which tracks private school openings and permanent closures along with tuition and demographic information when available. She also shares interesting stories in the education space, from innovative schools and exciting educational programs to inspiring students, parents, and teachers each week in Cato's Friday Featuring blog series. Please join me in welcoming tonight's speaker, Colleen Hroncich. Sorry, I should have had this ready. I just didn't want the tech guy to feel unwanted. Thank you. So thank you, Caitlin, and thank you, Robert Ryder and Paul Kangor, for letting me come and speak to you today. I actually grew up in Greenville, which isn't very far from here. If you're an athlete, maybe you play Teal College in your sports, so you may be a little bit familiar with it. But I have a long history of coming actually to Grove City College for speaking events. My first one was in the mid-90s. Walter Williams was an economist, and he used to teach a class here. He was a professor at George Mason University. And I came when he was speaking one time because I just had always admired him. So there's this long history of Grove City College having really great speakers, and we come for the Freedom Readers when they have those, or different speakers on campus. So to be on this side of the speaking engagement is pretty exciting for me. So thank you, really appreciate that. I thought I'd start with a little bit of my background. So I studied economics in college, and after college I interned with the American Enterprise Institute in DC. And then I got a job with the Allegheny Institute for Public Policy in Pittsburgh, and that's a local think tank, and that's actually where I met Dr. Kangor. So we've known each other for almost 25 years now. And it was a fun little thing where we studied local policies, but then I had my first child and I became a stay-at-home mom. So I had 4 kids altogether and was home with them for 17 years. And during that time, we had kind of an eclectic educational journey, I guess you could call it. So we started out, we planned to go to our local public school. We lived in Cranberry Township at the time. But as our daughter got closer and closer to school age, we just started seeing some things at the district that we weren't that happy with. So we started looking around at other options. We were a single income family, so we weren't even sure that we could afford these other options. But then we found a nice little Catholic school, and they told us about a school choice program that was offered through our state, in Pennsylvania. And that was kind of my first intro to school choice. So we did the Catholic school for several years. Eventually, with 4 kids, even with a school choice program, it gets pretty expensive, and it was pretty far away from home. So we ended up switching to homeschooling. We did a year of cyber school and then moved to homeschooling, and found it was a really great fit for our family. It gave us a lot of flexibility and gave the kids ability to try different things and to really dive deep on things that they were interested in. We did a lot of co-ops. We did speech and debate. Are there any homeschoolers in the room? Actually, I was curious. Okay. I'm guessing there might be even more than that, because if you're like my kids, you don't always admit to having been homeschooled. They always say that the biggest compliment they get is when someone is surprised that they were a homeschooler, right? So that was our journey. We moved to Grove City actually in large part because we knew that there was a strong homeschooling community here, and we were able to do classes at the Christian Academy, and then when they got in high school, dual enrollment classes here at the college. So a lot of really good things went along with that. So when my youngest was getting older, and I started thinking, what am I going to do once she's out of the nest, and I'm going to be here having done this for all these years? I need something to fall back on. So I found out about a program called the Koch Fellow Program, and some of you may have heard of the Koch internships or the Koch Associate Program. I think a lot of the Institute's students go on those. And so I did it as an old person. I was in my 40s, everyone else was in their 20s. It was a little bit awkward at time when they stuck me with a 20-year-old roommate in a hotel, and I won't get into that, but suffice it to say, there was some, there was an interesting experience. But the benefit of it was that I got to work for an organization called the Commonwealth Foundation, and it is a Pennsylvania-based free market think tank. And if you're interested in public policy and you live in Pennsylvania, I highly encourage you to look them up, the Commonwealth Foundation. They do all sorts of state issues, and even if you're interested in writing, there's a lot of writing opportunities. They do development work, they do government affairs, so it's a really great organization. And I was very fortunate because right around the time that I got there, their education policy person left. And so I was able to step into that role and using my lived experience. I think most people in my position probably have a master's degree, maybe a PhD, but my PhD was life, I guess. So I was able to take my experiences and just my passion for education and my understanding of how important this issue is for the future of not just our local communities in our state, but our country, and able to work in that, and it's just been really exciting for me. I even got to testify at the Senate Education Committee in Pennsylvania, so that was probably my highlight there. A few years ago, I found out that the Cato Institute was hiring, and Cato is a libertarian think tank, and it's headquartered in DC, and I would call it the most prestigious, libertarian think tank in the country, which isn't that high of a bar because there's not that many of them, but we'll claim it anyway. And so now I'm there. I'm a policy analyst in the Cato Institute's Center for Educational Freedom, and as part of that, I get to come and talk to you about school choice and education entrepreneurship. So what do I mean by school choice? We've kind of inherited this term because when these policies first came into being, it really was a choice between different schools. Kids are assigned to a local government-run public school, or with the school choice program, you can choose a different school. Things are different now, but we still kind of have inherited this term. We still mostly stick with it. So the way education works in America is states have set up compulsory education laws, and every student is mandated to attend school. Generally speaking, your local government school. You're assigned to a specific school, and a lot of times there's hoops that you have to go through if you don't want your child to go to that school. Maybe you don't know this, but homeschooling was actually illegal in America for many, many years, and really it's only in the late 80s was when the last couple of states made it legal to homeschool. So there were a lot of underground homeschoolers, people who were, hide if the truancy officer comes because the kids weren't in school. So there was this big push in the mid-1800s to put these compulsory education laws into place. A lot of that came, I won't go too deep into this, but a lot of it was kind of an anti-immigrant, nativist, anti-Catholic sentiment where you had all these immigrants coming from mostly Ireland and Germany. A lot of them were Catholics or they were Lutherans, which was different than kind of the Protestant norm in America. And so the people who considered themselves true Americans, they wanted to Americanize these immigrant populations, and so they started pushing compulsory education laws. Over time, every state adopted this. The first one was in Massachusetts in about 1852. And that really changed the face of education in America. It really crowded out the private options that had been kind of growing and just getting their feet under them. It really led to the creation of the Catholic school system because these so-called public schools were actually Protestant schools, and they often taught a pretty strong anti-Catholic curriculum. Some of the cartoons from the time I'm Catholic, so they're shocking to me, but I think even to most people that aren't Catholic, it would be shocking too, where they said that the papists are going to come and steal your children away and things like that. So that's where a lot of the groundwork was laid for what our education system looks like today. But over time, you can see why back in the 1850s they think, oh, let's build a school, and if you live near the school, that's where you go, right? Like, transportation was very hard, communication was very hard. But we don't live in that world anymore. And so that's why I think there's this big push for school choice, because people are increasingly realizing that there's a lot more ways to do this. So there's public school choice and private school choice. Public school choice is things like charter schools, magnet schools, open enrollment. I don't do as much on that. I focus more on private school choice, and so that's where I'm going to focus today. So with school choice programs, some of the funding that would go to the local school district instead can follow students to a variety of educational options. Right now, about 45% of funding comes from local taxpayers, another 45% or so from state taxpayers, and then about 10% or so from federal taxpayers. With the school choice program, that the state portion of that funding, or some part of it, follows the student instead to a different educational option. So the first programs that were created were vouchers. And that's where I was saying the school choice term came from, because you could go to your assigned public school, or you could choose a private school and use a voucher. That opened up a lot of opportunities for people, and really the first one was in Milwaukee in 1990. It was passed, and it was for low-income families in Milwaukee. And the impetus from that, it was a very bipartisan, black, white, all came together in this coalition because the schools were just really failing the kids, and this was a life-saving thing for them. But now it has spread, and so we now there's 25 voucher programs in 14 states. A lot of states will have more than one program because they'll be geared towards different populations, sometimes a specific city, sometimes low-income families, sometimes kids who have been assigned to poor-performing schools. So there's different categories that you can fall into that makes you eligible for one of these school choice programs. Then there's something called tax credit scholarships. So a tax credit scholarship functions like a voucher in that it can be used for private school tuition, but it's funded differently. So Pennsylvania actually, in 2001, started the first corporate tax credit scholarship in the country. And I like to mention that because it's kind of rare. If you're from Pennsylvania, you know this. It's very rare for our government to do something innovative. So it's good to give them a shout out whenever they have. So that was, the one time that they did. I can't think of another actually off the top of my head. But they did the first of these corporate tax credit scholarships. And what that does is it allows businesses and now individuals, they've broadened it, to donate money to scholarship organizations. And then they receive a credit on their state taxes to offset the cost of that scholarship. So it operates like the vouchers do, where it's just for private school tuition, but the funding mechanism isn't the state tax dollars, it's these donations. And I'm going to give a little bit more detail on that when I talk about Pennsylvania specifically. But there's now 24 of these tax credit scholarship programs in 20 states. And again, some states have more than one, targeted to different populations. Now, my favorite is education savings accounts. My family actually makes fun of me because I am such a fan of education savings accounts. But these ones really have the potential to transform education in America, because not just private schools can they be used for, but for all of you that were homeschooled, they can be used for expenses that homeschoolers have. Things like part-time classes, online classes, curriculum. A lot of them are geared towards kids with special needs, so they can do speech therapy and occupational therapy and all these different educational needs that they have that right now parents are struggling to afford. And meanwhile, we're spending all this money on the public schools that weren't working for their kids. Now they can get a portion of that and use it in a very flexible way. A great analogy that somebody shared with me once was television. So back probably when your grandparents were little, a television had maybe 3 channels and they came over the airwaves. And if you wanted to watch a show, you sat down at the time that it was on, and that was all you had. You had three shows to choose from at that time. When I was a kid, it was cable television. Everybody had cable television, and suddenly you had 50 or 80 channels to choose from, and you could see all these different shows, but it was still at a certain time. So you still had to be there at this specific time to watch this specific show. An improvement, but still somewhat limited. Now we have streaming. So you guys walk around with this computer in your pocket and you can watch any show you want, anywhere you want, whatever time you want, and it's just transformed a lot of our lives. And that's like these school choice programs. So the move from no school choice to voucher is kind of like getting cable TV. Suddenly you have a lot more options, but it's still at this specific place in this specific time with this specific menu that you're receiving. And education savings accounts is kind of like streaming. Suddenly there's a whole world of options available anywhere, anytime, any way you choose. The only limit is, has somebody in your area created it, or can you get to it, or is it online? So it's just, the potential for the transformation is huge. So the first one was in Arizona in 2012, and now there's 19 ESAs in 17 states. So this is the one that people are most excited about, not just me, for the most part these days. And there's tax credit education savings accounts, and you can probably kind of guess what that is. It operates like an education savings account, but it's funded like with a tax credit. So donors donate to these programs. Kids get the education savings accounts. The donors get the tax credits. And only Missouri and Florida have that right now. This one's a little bit complicated. So there are tax credits in a lot of states, but Oklahoma's is a little bit different. It is a refundable tax credit. If you haven't done your taxes yet, which I'm guessing maybe a lot of you don't do your taxes yet, it's kind of hard to explain the difference between a tax credit scholarship and a tax credit. But the way it works is when you pay your taxes, there's a certain amount that you'll owe the state. If you have spent money on your kid's education, then you can claim a credit against that money that you owe. So let's say you owe the state $4,000 and you spent $2,000 on your child's education. Depending on how the program works, you could get a credit of $2,000 off of your taxes, and now you only owe the state $2,000. The Oklahoma one, where right there that it's a refundable tax credit, that is because for lower income families, they don't obviously have as high of an income tax burden because they don't have the income. So in order to make sure that they are still benefiting from these programs, because of course lower income families really need the help the most, then they've made it refundable. So let's say your tax bill is $3,000, but your tuition was $5,000, you'll get that full $5,000 credit on your taxes. So it's almost kind of like a voucher, but it's through your taxes. They call it a tax credit. I think politically maybe it sells it easier than a voucher, I don't know. But it is another way to get that access for more people. So in the beginning, these programs were all generally geared towards specific populations. The Milwaukee one, low-income families living in the city of Milwaukee. Cleveland has one like that. The Arizona ESA was for kids with special needs so that they could do all these different therapies and really get the educational environment that they needed for them. A lot of them are limited by income or what school you're assigned to. But recently there's been a push for more universal eligibility, and that means that anyone in the state would be eligible. And that makes sense because every child in the state is mandated to attend school. Every family in the state is mandated to pay for these schools. So it makes sense that everyone would be eligible for these programs. The way it works in practice is they're not always fully funded. So even if technically everyone's eligible, it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone gets one. So North Carolina a couple years ago passed a universal voucher, but they currently have 50,000 kids on a wait list because so many kids applied and the money's not there. And they're trying to fix that right now, actually, today. So they've got a Republican supermajorities in their House and Senate. And just today, the House voted to override the governor's veto of the funding that will make up that gap. So if the Senate follows suit, then those kids that are currently on the wait list will receive their voucher. And doing things like that is how we're moving more towards this actual universal eligibility and universal access of these school choice programs. And that's going to have a lot of benefits, both in terms of how the programs work, but also in their survivability, because when everybody is eligible, then you just have a much broader constituency that will fight against the ending of these programs. So looking specifically at Pennsylvania, since we are in Pennsylvania, we have, as I mentioned, tax credit scholarships. So the Educational Improvement Tax Credit was started in 2001, and that's the one that we were able to use to send our kids to the Catholic school. And that is a statewide program. It does have an income cap, but it's a pretty generous income cap. It's around $110,000 per family, plus an additional $20,000 for each dependent. So it's a very generous program in terms of the income cap. Now, there's a companion program that was started about 10 years later, and that's the Opportunity Scholarship Tax Credit. And that functions the same as the EITC. The difference is that the OSTC is geared towards children who are assigned to the worst performing schools in the state. So we have state tests that our public schools take in certain grades. The Department of Education ranks the schools based on how they do on these tests. And then the schools that are in the lowest 15%, if your child has been assigned to that, you are eligible for one of these OSTC scholarships. Both of these are they function the same in terms of their income caps and the tax credit. If a business or an individual donates for 1 year, they get a 75% credit. If they do 2 years, they get a 90% credit. So not surprisingly, most people do the 2-year. So let's say that I wanted to donate to the Grove City Christian Academy's scholarship fund. If my tax bill was $10,000 and I donate for 2 years, then I get a $9,000 credit on my taxes. So I'll owe the state $1,000 still, but now I've been able to give my local school, this, in my community where my neighbors' kids go, $10,000 to help them. So it's a really great way for businesses and individuals to get more involved in these local school communities. And most people would rather send their money to the local school versus Harrisburg, because who knows what they're doing with it there. So a more recent addition to these programs is called the Economically Disadvantaged Schools, and that's a top-off for schools that they call economically disadvantaged, which means that a majority of kids in those schools received one of these scholarships the year before, and this is just a way to give those kids a little bit extra, because the thinking is that if most of the kids in your school need a scholarship, then probably you have a lot of economically disadvantaged families in your school, and this will help them. So. Now this table is a little bit messy, I will agree. There's a lot going on there, but the important columns are really this scholarships awarded. So this is in our tax credit scholarship plan. So the scholarships awarded, you can see that the most recent data available, more than 77,000 scholarships in Pennsylvania, which I think is pretty impressive. But this next column is not so impressive. 63,000, almost 64,000 scholarships were waitlisted because of these caps on the program, and kids are applying for them, but the money's not there. And then the other important column is this one, where you see an average scholarship of $2,200. For context, our schools spend, does anyone want to hazard a guess on how much our public schools spend per student? Okay, any other guesses? 10, okay. Anyone else want to try? Okay, so it's $22,000 in Pennsylvania is what our schools guess. So your guess was actually much closer. A lot of people guess like 8,000 or 5,000, and they're shocked 22,000. So when these tax credits are only 2,200, and then our private school tuition is about 12,000 on average. So you can see that there's a big gap between what these tax credit scholarships are and what our public schools are spending while saying that they're underfunded, or what our private school average tuition is. So recent years, is in the last couple columns, you can see the cap has increased a lot, even with Democrat governors, because they've done it as part of the budget. So hopefully, as we see the data coming in for the more recent years, hopefully we see more scholarships awarded, and hopefully that average scholarship goes up, because then more kids are getting the education that works better for them, for their families. So all of this is happening, and what's the impact of it, right? Like, we've got all these new school choice programs coming along, and is it really changing things? And yes, it is. So the stuff I'm talking about, kind of historically, where you go to your local public school or your local private school, it's called a bundled education, and everything is happening there. So you've got your core academic classes, your enrichment classes, your extracurricular activities, and kind of an underappreciated, maybe until COVID aspect of it, was childcare, right? Like, a lot of parents, when the schools closed, they didn't know what to do with their children because they had to go to work, and kind of the bargain with society has been that public schools will take care of your children while you're at work. Suddenly that wasn't happening. So it's a bundle. But now more and more people are unbundling, and that's kind of what homeschoolers have always done, where we didn't do the one-stop shop. We did a little bit here and a little bit there, and maybe some here and some at home and some online, and just a lot of picking and choosing of what was working for your family. So maybe we wonder, well, is this actually benefiting people? Are people taking advantage of these opportunities? And there was a study in Florida a few years ago with their ESA program, and they found that when people first got the ESA, they basically used it like a voucher. So they were using the ESA and they were sending their kids to full-time private school, which is fine. But more and more, as time went on, more families were becoming what they call customizers. So they were doing a little bit here, a little bit there, and really creating a different educational path for their kids. So no two educations necessarily look alike, but no two kids are the same either, so that's a good thing. So that there is evidence of this in practice where it is working the way that you kind of think that it would work. And then, of course, we're seeing a growth in microschools and hybrid schools and a la carte options. and I will get into those in more detail, but I wanted to detour just for a second and talk about strings. And I think in this venue, of, if no other, it's good to talk about what strings are attached with these regulations, because most of you probably know that Grove City College opts out of federal funding because they don't want the strings. There was a lawsuit back in the late 70s, early 80s, Grove City College versus Bell, went all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is where they were fighting to say, if we don't participate in these federal programs, we should not be tied to the federal regulations. So there's that same idea and that same concern with these school choice programs. It's a little bit different in K-12 because these are mandatory. K-12 education is mandated by the state. The funding of it is mandated by the state. The provision of it is mandated by the state. So it's a little bit different, but it is still a legitimate concern. And so far, for the most part, these programs have not come with any regulations that are on them are generally there at the outset. So it hasn't typically been the case that a program is created without a lot of regulations and then the regulations are added on to it, or they put new strings on the private schools or the homeschoolers. So for me, that's a good thing. But I think we also need to be very vigilant and be aware that regulators always want to regulate and bureaucrats always want more bureaucracy. So you just have to, whether there's a school choice program in your state or not, you just have to keep your eye out for these things. There was an example in Georgia a couple of years ago where the Republicans wanted to put kind of this divisive content legislation on private schools because they didn't want them teaching kind of the woke stuff. And that's fine if you, it's one thing to do it on a public school because they are government schools. Like a government school, it's going to have government rules about what it can and cannot teach. That's part of the bargain. If you want, the government funding, the government mandate, you're going to have the government rules. But in the private sector, it's just different. And even when you have these school choice programs, it's very important for the private sector to retain its independence because otherwise it's going to look just like the public sector and then people aren't going to have any real choice after all. So they pushed back and it didn't go through. And the same thing in other states. West Virginia, after they did their Hope Scholarship ESA, some of the lawmakers tried to put new rules on it, but the supporters of the program pushed back. In Arizona, they elected a Democrat governor right after passing school, universal school choice, and the governor does not favor universal school choice or any school choice. So she's always trying to put new, strings around it and tie their hands and everything. So they just had to push back. So with or without funding, people just have to be vigilant because the government does want to regulate you more than it currently does. It always will want to do that. So vigilance is required with or without the funding. So the bottom line is on all of this, the education entrepreneurship is booming. And these are all different people that have created microschools and hybrid schools all around the country. And there's just really amazing things happening. What's in a name? I keep tossing around microschools and hybrid schools. So homeschooling, obviously a lot of you are familiar with. And it doesn't necessarily just mean schooling at home. It's more about the legal framework that gives you the flexibility to not be in school 5 days a week, which is what the compulsory education laws require. So you can be a homeschooler and do all these other educational options. We used to joke that we were never at homeschoolers because we were in so many activities. And I remember after COVID hit and the schools were closed and people were like, oh, we're all homeschoolers now. And the homeschoolers were like, no, this is not what our lives are normally like. It's just not. So some misconceptions there, but basically homeschooling is the way that in most states you can have the flexibility to take advantage of these different educational options. Microschools, as the name implies, is a small school, right? That seems kind of self-evident, but it's a lot more than that. You can have a school that is small because enrollment has dwindled and nobody likes that school. But with a microschool, it's small by design. It's intentionally small, and sometimes it's as small as 5 people in a house, literally, and they call it a microschool. I toured one recently. This woman started in her home for her son who has autism and several other kids who are autistic. And this lady was a teacher, and the one student in her class would come and he would sit underneath the table because he had been so traumatized in his previous school, and that was the only safe place that he could find. And she was seeing the different things that were happening in her public school for these kids with special needs, and she just couldn't handle it anymore. And so she pulled her own son out. She started this microschool in her home, and now these 4 kids, and her capacity is 6. Like if she's at capacity, she's got 6 kids in her entire school. but they were running all over the place and they were having conversations with us. And she said normally they, before they got so feeling comfortable in that space, they would freeze whenever anybody came, and it was awful. But then to see the way that they've grown just by having this supportive one-on-one small group environment, it was amazing. So sometimes they're as small as that. Sometimes there might be 100 kids in a micro school, but it's divided in a different way. So it's very small classes, not really just age segregated. So it's not about when your birthday is, which class you're in, it's about your abilities. So maybe you're really good in math, so you're with this group in math, but maybe you struggle in reading, so you're with this other group in reading. So it's just a much more flexible approach to education and really trying to meet kids where they are. And different things too. There's a lot more project-based learning in a micro school versus just sitting at a desk and being lectured to. And for a lot of kids, they need that. They need that active learning instead of the passive learning. So micro schools, more than just a small school, it's kind of a whole philosophy of education. Then there's hybrid schools, which are schools that are sometimes at home and sometimes in school. So you're probably, most states you'd be enrolled as a homeschooler, but maybe you go to classes 2 or 3 days a week and you're at home the other 2 or 3 days a week with a specific curriculum that you're following, or it could be half days at home and half days in school. So there's a lot of different ways you can set these up, and there's a lot of overlap. Some micro schools have a hybrid schedule, some hybrid schools are micro schools. So it's not really this very easily defined thing, which can be challenging. The good thing is it makes it hard for the regulators to regulate something that they can't define. But it also makes it hard for researchers to research the thing that they can't define. So there's pros and cons. I overall am on the let it all be loosey-goosey side of things, which I guess is why I work at a libertarian think tank. So. And then there's learning pods, and these really came out of COVID, where when schools were shut down and parents were looking for something to do with their kids and a way to have community for them and some adult support for themselves, and they started these learning pods a lot of times in their houses, and those have continued. And there's a lot of similarities between learning pods and hybrid schools and micro schools, and sometimes it's literally just what you decide to call your place. And then there's a la carte options, and these are especially booming in the ESA states, where people can just, there's all these different providers, and you have a micro school, and you can have somebody come in for cooking classes, and somebody coming in for science classes, and somebody coming in for writing classes. There's a place called Surf Skate Science in Florida where they use surfing and skating to teach the kids about science. So I have a few examples that I wanted to share with you of some of these schools. And I can't see the clock, but Trinity Arch Preparatory School for Boys. And the thing I like about this is this guy here, Jack Pinnell, he lived in Baltimore. He was a businessman, and he started running a charter school down in Baltimore. So a charter school, it's a public school, but the whole design, the whole purpose of charter schools is to give them more flexibility, less regulation, and to be able to do creative things. But despite that purpose, he was so frustrated by the school. It was for boys. It was in inner city Baltimore. It was majority black boys. And he knew that there were specific needs in this community, and he wanted to be able to reach them. And he wanted to give them a better life because he was seeing a lot of problems in the community. He got so frustrated by the regulations, even in the charter sector, and then he heard about ESAs, and he heard about micro schools, and he moved to Arizona to start a micro school using the ESAs, and he wanted to purposely, it's for boys ages 10 to 14, and because of the ESA, he's got about a third of the kids are low income, about a third of the kids are middle income, and about a third of the kids are upper income. And that was by design. He wanted that. He wanted a diverse group socioeconomically, racially, from all these different backgrounds, so that they can get together and bring their different strengths and grow awareness. And it's a Christian school. That's another benefit of it being a private school. And he's just trying to build young men of character so that when they go off into high school and beyond, they've had that solid formation. And I just thought it was pretty amazing that he moved to Arizona literally just to start the school. So I wanted to share him. And then Onward Learning is another really neat one, where this is it's called the Pine Ridge Reservation. It is a Native American reservation in South Dakota. The lady who started it grew up on the reservation. She's a member of the tribe. She became a school teacher, and she was teaching in the public schools there. And she was just so frustrated. And that's a very common theme when you talk to these teachers. A lot of the micro schools are started by teachers. And she was frustrated because she knew the problems that were on this reservation. She said it's the poorest area in the country. alcoholism skyrocketing, 90% unemployment in some cases, huge drug problems, kids dropping out of school at alarming rates. And so she quit her job and started a micro school. She charges $3,000 a year per kid. That's nothing, but she does that because otherwise nobody would be able to afford it. They don't have yet a school choice program that would work for this type of a school there. But she just wanted to, she started it in her home because she just wanted to have that option for kids. It's grown beyond her home now. She actually moved and uses her former house for the micro school. A one-room schoolhouse is actually right near Pittsburgh, and it was started by a woman during COVID. She was wanting to homeschool and got some friends together, and they started a little micro school in their basement, and then more and more people learned about it, and they would come and say, can we be part of it? And so she expanded to a church, and now she has 4 locations kind of surrounding Pittsburgh, and it's just really growing, and people love it. And it's a hybrid one, so they meet, I think, 2 days a week, and they do some of their their schoolwork on those days, and they have a lot of outdoors. She uses kind of a Charlotte Mason approach, who was a British education philosopher that does a lot of hands-on and a lot of action-based, learning and project-based learning. And so she wanted to offer that for her community, and it's been very successful right around Pittsburgh. And then forest schools. So I had never heard of a forest school until I started this job. Has anybody heard of a forest school? They're wild. They're literally outside. These classrooms are outside. And in this one, I mean, granted, okay, that's easier in Georgia than in Pennsylvania, but there are some in the north. And they built these classrooms, and the kids have all their classes outside, rain or shine. They have this one here. That's called creek cess. Instead of recess, they have creek cess. And the kids go and play in the creek. And they also do, they were doing that when I was there, and they also do, they take water samples there, and they do the water sampling of that creek for the town, and they submit it to the local government, and that's part of their science lesson. So it's just, I don't know, I just love the forest schools. And then I was talking about the a la carte program. So Project Flourish is down in Florida. A lot of these a la carte places are booming in Florida because of their very widespread ESA. And this was a husband and wife chef team, and they started it. The husband works in a school as a chef, but the wife started doing this home because they were seeing kids coming, I think it's a college where he is, and they just saw how little kids were, the young adults were coming to college with such no knowledge of cooking really, and no knowledge of nutrition, and no understanding of kind of the connection of our food and our land and everything. So she holds classes in her home, in her kitchen, in her garden, or she'll go to micro schools and bring the stuff there. And it's very much about sustainable eating and sustainable living, and just having that connection that our ancestors did have with the food, and most of us don't anymore. And so that's what she created this. And then I Have a Scientist is another one down in Florida, and this was a neuroscientist who she was doing some substitute teaching in a local school and was just horrified by the science program there. And she thought, no wonder kids don't like science. This is terrible. So she started her own program, and now she does like the Project Flourish. She goes to micro schools and has these science experiments and science lessons, and just really engaging the kids in science. Or else for homeschoolers, they can come to, she'll hold lessons in a park, or there's a library near her that has a laboratory, and so they'll hold lessons there. So that's, I mean, it's an amazing world. I meant to ask, how many of you are education majors? That's awesome. So you guys are coming an education major at the most amazing time. And the number of people that I talked to who were former public school teachers, they have masters, maybe PhDs, and they never learned any of this stuff at school. And even though, yeah, it's newer, but it's not brand new. I mean, micro schools existed before COVID, just most of us had never heard of them. But they don't hear about them in their training, and so they get locked into these systems, and a lot of people, they quit teaching because it kind of sucks. And a lot of public schools, and then they find out about this whole other world, and you can go, I tell my one daughter especially, I think she'd make a great teacher, I tell her, move to an ESA state. You can open your own micro school. It can be whatever you want it to be, and the kids will have the money to pay the tuition, and I'm very excited by the possibilities, not just for the students now or the teachers now, and really most of these are started by former public school teachers who got frustrated by the system, but just for what it means for our society moving forward. I think that when we have kids who are coming through these wildly diverse education systems, and then they're all landing in adulthood together, either at college or in jobs, I just think it's going to kind of have a renaissance for our country, because you're going to have creative thinkers and deep thinkers and all these different skill sets coming together, and I just think it's very exciting. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. There's my contact information. If you want more info on any of this, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer. Okay, my email address is there. Happy to answer anything. And if you don't have any questions, I'm just going to assume that means I did a really great job up here. So.
For anyone with questions, just go ahead and raise your hand and we'll have someone come around to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. My question is, in your research, have you come across any states that, for instance, are giving different funding to different students based upon their needs? Because obviously certain students are more expensive to educate than others.
Absolutely. So I can't tell you exactly which states are doing it which way, honestly, because I don't necessarily remember. But there are states that do different things. So sometimes it'll be kids with special needs will get a bump up. So there's a percentage, like Arizona, I do know, they, in their ESA program, which was created originally for kids with special needs, the kids with special need get funding based on what the local public schools spend on kids with those needs. So it is, if you are a kind of neurotypical child, as they call, then you'd get a much lower funding, maybe around $6,700 to $7,000. But if you have very high needs, it can be upwards of $30,000 per student. And yeah, it's based largely on what the public schools are spending. In other states, it's more of an income-based. So the Oklahoma program that I mentioned, families that are at the lower income spectrum, they'll get $7,500 as their tax credit. And it's tiered, goes up like $7,500 to $7,000, up to $5,000. So depending on your income. So the higher income families are still eligible for the program, but they get $5,000 per child, whereas the lower income get $7,500, and then it's tiered in between those. So yes, a lot of states are doing that. Not all states yet, but it is something that people are aware of the need for. So West Virginia, for example, I'm pretty sure theirs is just a flat rate. It's $4,600 or thereabouts. It's a lower cost state, so it's a much lower number, but I'm pretty sure they don't do that. But it is something that there's growing awareness of, and people are trying to figure out ways to build that into programs.
So what's your assessment of the Department of Education and its outlook in this country?
So,
two questions, actually. Yeah,
I mean, the federal, there's no reason at all that we have a federal Department of Education. It's not at all constitutional. It has not been at all helpful. There's a lot of charts showing that, since the Department of Education's been around, test scores have either been flat or have even decreased. Spending has gone through the roof. The kind of admin staff in schools is huge. So will they succeed in closing it? I don't know. I mean, there's definitely a big push for it, of course, but there'll be a big push back too. So is it politically realistic? I don't know. But I think that just the fact that the conversation is going to be very vocal versus in Trump's first term, it was something that they kind of talked about. Betsy DeVos is certainly somebody that would have happily fired herself, from the job of education secretary if she could have. But it's a lot harder than that to dismantle a cabinet level department, of course. But I do think that they'll try at the very least to phase out the most egregious wasting of money, and so that should help. If it did close, all that would do really is a lot of the programs that are currently being funneled through the Department of Education, they would just go straight to the states instead. So all you do is save a lot of money that's currently being paid to bureaucrats. So
well, and somewhat of a follow-up question to that is, I know in the state of Ohio, there's, I believe at least there are some active lawsuits by public entities pushing back against some of these changes. I think at least even confirmed by your charts that Ohio is one of the more flexible states. So any comment on status of those kinds of efforts by those opposing this?
Yeah, so the opponents of school choice, which is pretty much the public school establishment. It's the teachers' unions especially, school board associations, superintendent associations, basically people whose job is tied to the public school, because who doesn't want to eliminate their competition through a lawsuit, right? So they do tend to do lawsuits, and I don't know the status specifically of Ohio. They do have a universal voucher that they passed a couple of years ago, and I don't know. I do think you're right that there was a lawsuit filed. A lot of times there's a couple of libertarian, liberty-leaning law firms that do those, like Institute for Justice and Liberty Justice Center. So there are there are firms that take on those cases. There's a group called EdChoice, which is where my maps all came from. That data is edchoice.org, and they started with the Institute for Justice a new, they're doing like a joint law firm that is specifically to support these education freedom, school choice programs. So there are people that are fighting them. I don't know the specific status of that one, but pretty much every time there's a school choice program, there's at least one lawsuit. And it's always by the same crowd.
Colleen, so you said $22,000 a year on average in Pennsylvania public schools?
Right.
So that's obviously an average.
Yeah.
Now, what would be some of the higher districts, Allegheny County? What are they spending?
Pittsburgh is more than $30,000 per student, and their results are atrocious. There's one of the little school districts around Pittsburgh, I can't remember which one it is, has a very high spending and just atrocious results. Now, there are some that are much lower funded, and there is a lot of imbalance because of the way we fund our schools. We fund them through some property tax and some state income tax. So obviously the wealthier school districts. I talked to a woman who her own personal property taxes, she lived outside of Philly, were $20,000 for her schools. So her school district is spending a ton of money, but they're taxing their local residents to do that, and people are, for some crazy reason, willing to do it. So there are, like, Mars actually is not a bad school district, and I think their spending is only around maybe around 16 or 17,000 per student. So there's a wide variety. There was a lawsuit that just wrapped. It took like 7 years to make it through the courts, but it was the school funding lawsuit in Pennsylvania saying that how unfair the funding was, and the judge ruled that yes, the funding is unfair. But the nice thing is that she didn't prescribe a remedy, which I mean, I think it's the right call. When you're a judge, you're not really supposed to prescribe the remedy. She said the lawmakers need to, but the way she worded it is that there's a lot of different ways that you could solve this problem, and the way my side read that is school choice could solve this problem, because the real way, like, you're never going to fix educational disparities by spending more money in a school, because the money doesn't tend to, there's literally no evidence once you reach a certain amount that more funding helps with a school district. The thing that helps is competition. And in Florida, where I think there's like slightly less than 50% of students are attending their assigned school anymore. A lot of them are charter schools or open enrollment or the school choice programs. And their public schools have jumped to the top of the pack because now they know that they have to do a good job if they want to keep their kids. So competition is the only way that you're really ever going to fix these schools and make them improve. And the judge's ruling, fortunately, did kind of leave that as an avenue. So it's not the avenue that gets attention in the media, of course, but it was open-ended enough.
If I could ask a follow-up. So 2020 was COVID, and we also had, there was a big period of CRT, wokeism, all the stuff that's been happening in public schools. And a lot of parents learned that they could homeschool during COVID.
And they didn't actually hate having their kids home with them.
Right. So they thought, well, I could do this, right? Now, probably a lot of others said, I don't want to do this, yeah. Right? But so how much of an increase in homeschooling and how much of a movement out of public schools has there been since 2020? Is that like a watershed year?
It definitely is, and the neat thing is that it has stayed that way. So I want to say, I've read the stats recently, that the decrease in public school enrollment has been maybe 3 or 4%, which doesn't sound like a ton, but there's like 50 million kids in our public school system. So that's a lot of kids that have exited the system since 2020. And homeschool stats are a little bit tricky because not every state tracks them, but Johns Hopkins started a homeschool hub, they call it, and it's all this homeschool data, and their estimate is around 5 or 6% of kids now are homeschooled, and most stats seem to think maybe 75 to 80% nationwide attend their assigned public school. A little bit less than 10% go to private school, a little bit less than 10 to charter schools, and 5 or 6% are homeschooling now, which prior to that, it was probably like 2 or 3%. So it's been pretty huge. And it's really diverse now, whereas stereotypically it's white Christian conservatives who are the homeschoolers, and that has been the case for a lot of time, but now there's a lot more minorities and a lot more other religions, Muslims and Jewish and secular, so it's becoming much more diverse on top of being much more widespread. So, there was a question up here too, right? You saw that? Okay.
How difficult is it? I went to a public school my entire life. How difficult is it to meet standards for homeschooling? And if you have the hybrid or the ones where you can even choose from different providers, how difficult is that to put together and meet those standards and say, yes, my child is meeting the state's requirements? Right.
So kind of shockingly, a lot of states have no requirements. So there's a lot of states where you don't register, you don't do anything. They're just like, they're your kids, like we trust you, I guess. And Pennsylvania is considered one of the highest regulation states. So in a previous version of this, I had a map actually. HSLDA is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association, and they've fought a lot of the battles that have secured the rights for people to homeschool. And they color code states based on how hard the homeschool regulations are, and we're red. Like, we're one of the 3 hardest to do, and our requirements are so easy. They really are. So you have to file an affidavit at the beginning of the year. You give them kind of a plan of what you're going to do, very vague. Like most people say, be as vague as you possibly can, because there's no teeth to it. So there's these kind of hoops that you jump through, but there's no teeth. Like the superintendent that you file your report with, he can't do anything about it really, unless if they suspect that you're not educating your kids at all, then they can take you to court. But in general, I've never heard of that happening with just a regular family. And then at the end of the year, you get an evaluation, but you choose your evaluator. They have to be a certified public school teacher, but a lot of homeschool parents are certified public school teachers, and they understand homeschooling, so they're not looking for you to replicate public school at home, because some people try to do that, and it doesn't tend to work very well, because the reason that public schools are set up the way they are is because you're trying to herd a large group of kids who may or may not want to be there through a bunch of subjects that they may or may not want to be studying. But at homeschool, you're not doing that, because you're 1-on-1, 2-on-1, depending on how many kids you have, 8-on-1, and it's just a much different environment. So it's not hard. Some states make it a little bit harder than others, and so in the states where these hybrid schools, like in Pennsylvania, there are rules about, that parents are supposed to be like the ones in charge of the education, but it doesn't mean you can't pay somebody else to teach the classes. At least nobody's ever ruled that you can't, so people kind of get around it by doing that, but it's still ultimately the parents' responsibility to show, and there are requirements that you have to teach certain subjects every year, but it's not defined how much you do it. You just have to do 180 days or 900 hours, and I mean, it's fairly easy to do the days. I don't know anybody that counts the hours. That would be crazy. So, but yeah, so it's not difficult, and I don't think there's any evidence that more of those regulations make it any better either, because people that are going to abuse a system are going to find workarounds for the things that are out there to try to make them not abuse it, and fortunately, most people aren't abusing their children, so.
We're going to do one last question.
This goes to the changing demographic that you mentioned amongst homeschoolers and the strings that you talked about earlier. Have you noticed at all, since the demographics has changed a little from what it traditionally was in homeschooling in Pennsylvania, that the adversity to some of these ESAs and stuff amongst the homeschool community has diminished? It seemed like amongst the homeschool community, nobody wanted those because they didn't want the strings that attached. But as the demographic has changed, does it seem like that's back on the table a little bit?
Absolutely, yes, that's very perceptive of you. So traditional homeschoolers, the ones who fought for the legal right to homeschool, and it's very easy to understand, if you literally had to file a lawsuit to be able to educate your kids at home, no wonder you don't want the government anywhere near that, right? I mean, I get that. But now we're kind of a generation or two removed from that, and a lot of new people have coming in, and it's a very different mindset. And even, I'm kind of in that kind of middle generation, I guess, like when I was with my kids. So a lot of my, the parents that I knew as homeschoolers, they were part of those fights. So they did go through all that, but the ones after me didn't. So it's definitely changing, and HSLDA is still very against any of these programs. And, kudos to them. As long as they don't fight them, they don't typically fight them unless it loops in homeschoolers. And there's ways to allow for flexible funding without calling them homeschoolers. And so that's been kind of like a compromise that HSLDA has gone along with. But if you do polls of homeschoolers today, you get very, very wide support for the school choice funding. So I guess we're done.